Hi, this is Joel Tax with Reserve Data Analysis. Today I'm just going to go over a comparison of two different reserve studies on the same property. It kind of pains me to make this video, but it came to light when I was at a recent meeting, and somebody had stated that they didn't really understand the reserve study process and how two different companies can come to dramatically different results. And it is something that should not happen as long as both reserve studies are comprehensive and they have the same basic parameters and assumptions, which most do. If not, it should certainly be spelled out in the reserve study of why something was or was not reserved for, or certain assumptions like a threshold amount for a component, whatever the case is. So I'm going to go over two studies today. One was one we completed, and one was another company completed. And we were asked to do a level 2 study at first, which means that we use the prior component list off the prior reserve study for our study, and we assume that that component list is correct. Upon reviewing the component list before we accepted the assignment, we found that the component list was one, very, very short, and two, appeared to have inaccuracies and missed some items like quantities of components and things like that that we just did not feel comfortable taking somebody else's word for. So we did a level 1, and we finished that, sent that out, and it had just dramatically different results than their prior reserve study. So I'm going to go over today how that happens and what you can look for in your reserve study to see possibly if it's one that was done well or not. Reserve study providers, like any other industry, there are companies that do a great job. There are companies that do less than average. Some companies hire trainees. Some evidently have a lot of work where they just do a poor job. So it's unfortunate. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, as well. This is a somewhat regular thing that we see. So I always like to just kind of get this out there, let the buyer and users of these reserve studies understand that a reserve study is only as good as the information that's inputted into it and the due diligence that somebody puts into it. So let's get started here. Okay, so as I mentioned, this reserve study was completed. Both these studies were completed on the same property, about 2 years apart. So some of the cost differences will be just related to inflation, but it's very minor compared to the difference in our outcomes, as you'll see in just a moment. The biggest impact on a reserve study and the outcomes and recommendations and allocation rates and things like that is it's all based on the component list. By far the most important aspect of the reserve study is the component list. If the component list is inaccurate, if it's missing components or has incorrect measurements of components or quantities, those will have dramatic impacts on the rest of the study and the funding models in that study. So as you can see here, I just highlighted a few items on these two reserve studies. So on the left is the old reserve study from the other company, and I've blacked out here names and whatnot of the association, so that's going to be hidden. But on the left side, you'll see the other reserve study company's component list for this community. It's a total here of 25 items, 25 components, and it's listed alphabetically here in the list, as well as the cost of the components, and I put down here the total. This was another part of their reserve study, but this is just the total current cost of all these components in the reserve study. Now this community had about 280 units, and I think it was about 33 buildings. So it was pretty large for this region. And when we saw this figure right off the get-go of only 1,720,000 and only 25 components in the reserve study, that immediately got our attention. That did not make any sense for this size of community. Should be significantly more. as far as the component list goes and as far as the total cost for those components. On the right side is our component list. You can see we've kind of broken it down differently. That's not too big of a deal, but we just separated out the way they liked it. So we have 85 components in our reserve study, and we have 85 components, and we have total cost of $5,314,000. Now, that is a dramatic difference there between those two reserve studies. This other company, I can tell you, I've seen other reserve studies before, and they do tend to not include a lot of components. They've been doing reserve studies for a while. I've never been able to figure out why they continue to leave components off the component list. Doesn't make any sense to me. These are not items that are hidden away or difficult to see. These would be components right out in the open that are very, very obvious. So that's the first big mistake, and the first big difference between these two reserve studies is the comparables, the component list are just not the same. Ours is dramatically longer and has a dramatically larger total component cost of over $5 million versus theirs, which was approaching $2 million. But that's a dramatic difference, and that dramatic difference is going to then impact the reserve recommendations, the allocation rates, and the percent funded, and all the other aspects of the reserve study. It's all based on the component list. So if you have an inaccurate component list, you absolutely will have an inaccurate reserve study, without a doubt. Now this community, obviously they were very surprised by this. As we'll see in a minute, they thought they were at a high funded level, and they felt confident in their allocation rate to the reserve account for the foreseeable future. And so we came in at dramatically different results, and they had a question of, well, are these projects going to occur? Why were they left out of the prior reserve study? Most of the questions related to how can our component list be so much larger than the prior component list? And that's a great question. I have no idea why the prior component list was only 25 components. Didn't make any sense to me. I was on site for a full day and did a full site inspection with quantities and measurements and all that good stuff and notes. And it was very apparent to me that these components were there, and we're just basing them off of average useful lives and whatnot. So I couldn't answer their questions, unfortunately. They're going to have to go back to the other company and figure out why a component list would be so dramatically different. It just didn't make any sense to me. So also in this component list that you'll see, in their component list, they use, and this is a huge difference here. I'm going to show you kind of just apples to apples here. We have painting and ceiling as one of the categories, and we have an estimate here of $365,000 for painting and ceiling in that community. As for the buildings and some carports and some trash enclosures and whatnot. And now they also have a painting, painting and phase 1 and phase 2 of the paintings of the buildings, and their total cost here, which is right here, 82 and 82, so we're looking about 164,000. So it's about half of what we're estimating for the cost to paint these buildings and whatnot. Now what they used was phase 1 and phase 2. I have a big problem with just phases, because what is a phase? That's not a measurement, it's a title, and there was no other measurements in the reserve study for these two phases. So I have no idea if they used even accurate measurements. In our reserve study here, we have measurements for square footage for painting and ceiling for each building, or each building type, and then we broke it down for the square footage for the combination of the building types, the cabana and the carports. They just have phase 1 and phase 2. Is that accurate? I have no idea. I have no idea even if they used the correct measurements. And obviously the cost is dramatically different. They have almost double the cost that we do. Excuse me, half the cost that we do. So right there's a dramatic difference. And that certainly contributes to the cost difference between the total cost difference of 1.7 million compared to ours, which is over 5 million. And that's the case also here down with roofing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I don't know their measurements on the roofing, and this is why we didn't want to use this prior reserve study, because we didn't feel comfortable basing everything off somebody else's work. So here we have roofing. We have some other items in there as well, which they were for some reason missing in the reserve study. We based on squares. That's how roofers typically give their bids, and we have a measurement for those different building roofs, and then we have a total. And again, for some reason, I don't know why they did not include measurements. Maybe they were using somebody else's work. I have no idea. But at least for the painting part, it had dramatically different total cost, which tells me that either their costs were inaccurate, and I've looked further in the reserve study, and the cost did not look to be out of line. So it must be the measurements. Something is wrong with the measurements. It just didn't make any sense why we would have such dramatically different results. But again, their whole component list is dramatically different. So that tells me right away somebody did not put the time and effort into first developing a full component list on the reserve study. So that being said, let's show the results of two dramatically different reserve studies. If they have different component lists, how does that impact the rest of the reserve study? And how I'm going to do this is just by showing you the current funding models in their reserve study and in ours. So this is current funding in theirs, current funding in ours. And by current funding, I mean the allocation rate that they're currently putting into the reserve account. So this was done a couple years ago for the other reserve study, and they had an allocation rate of 102,000. We were told they have a current allocation rate of 106,000. So it has gone up a little bit. There's some minor difference here. It's not minor. There are some differences here. We assume that they would be increasing their allocation rate each year from this 106,000 by 3% a year. Now, so that's helping their current funding model. In their assumptions, they said it was just going to stay the same 102,000 for the full 30 years of the study. That's fine. That assumption's fine. It is going to make a dramatic difference. Ours, if we switch that to just 106,000, they would be in a much, much, much worse financial position than even that we're going to show right now. So you can see here in the starting balances, and there's some minor difference here. They have a starting balance. We have an ending balance. That's the same fiscal year, but the balance there is different by probably 12 months. I'm assuming they're starting when they say start balance, I'm assuming that's the beginning of the year for them, and it's at the end of the year in our software. Not a big difference there. It's just one item that can make a small difference. But as you can see, in the starting balance, they have 649,000, and it goes up significantly over the years. It does finally go into a negative balance towards the end of the 30-year period. As opposed to ours, they have significantly less as a projected ending reserve, and it within just a few years goes into a significant deficit, negative $400 and some odd thousand. Now, obviously, the bank's not going to let you carry a negative balance of $400 and some odd $1,000. We like to show it to show the client the degree of deficit that they're likely to fall. They're going to have to come up with that money somehow, whether it's a loan or a special assessment or whatever the case is. So right away you see the projected bank balances are dramatically different, and it's because we have dramatically higher cost in our reserve study, and we have dramatically higher number of projects than the prior reserve study had. And this parlays into the percent funded figures. They have in 2015 84% funded level. Now that would be a high funded level. That would be a position where the client has a very low risk for reliance on special assessments or loans or deferred maintenance. And in this prior study, they show this high funding level, which is above 70% funded for about 6 years here. And it does fall, but it still stays, fairly funded, fair to a low kind of good funded range for most of the reserve study until it falls into deficit even on this prior study in the later years. Now in our reserve study, we show a current percent funded of 6%. So the difference there, even though it's a couple years different, so we look at their research study, even at 2017, they had 83% funded projection, and we have 6% funded. That's a dramatic difference there. So why is that? Well, it's because, the main reason is because the component list is dramatically different and the costs are dramatically different. We're projecting them to run out of money in a very, very short period of time, and they're in a very, very poor financial position. Whereas before we had done this study, they had the assumption that they were in a very high percent funded level where they had plenty of money to pay for these projects. It just didn't make any sense. Now, upon speaking with the manager of the association, they said they did have some extra expenses that popped up between the prior reserve studies and ours that were not expected, but they were not large expenses. So I'm not really sure what the difference here is, or why they came to a dramatically different component list than we did. It just doesn't make any sense. So from our point of view, it's just not a comprehensive reserve study. And there's a few items that you should look at in your reserve study, and that's the component list, number one. Go through that and make sure that the things that you see out in the community are listed on that component list somewhere. If you see large items that are just not listed whatsoever, that's going to be an issue. In this particular reserve study, they had a large number of carports, and they all had roofs that were in poor condition. They're in poor condition now. They were in pretty poor condition then. Weren't even listed on this prior study. I have no idea why. They just weren't there, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in a reserve expense that just was not listed. Let's see here, carports. So 155,000 expense that they didn't even include in the reserve study, and which was coming due almost immediately. So we have it out in 2019 as having to replace all these roofs, these carport roofs. Yeah, it wasn't listed in the prior reserve study. And that's exactly how a community goes from a position of thinking they're well funded to a position of being poorly funded in a very, very short period of time. They just have large expenses that they should know about, and they didn't. And in this case, this community obtained a prior reserve study, and it was just a poorly done reserve study. They just did not include items that should have been listed. So hopefully that gives you kind of a general idea and understanding of the component list and the importance in the reserve study. Also, how two reserve studies can have dramatically different results. Like I say, most of the time it's due to the component list. There'll be some differences with, they changed the allocation rate, or they put some more money in the reserve account, or they had some larger expenses than were expected. But if the initial reserve study component list is not accurate, that is going to have by far the biggest impact on whether a community is well funded or poorly funded. And in our two reserve studies had dramatically different results because of that component list and how much they're putting in the reserve account and all that good stuff. So hopefully that was a little bit helpful. If you have any questions, please give us a call. We'd be happy to discuss this with you and any current reserve study that you may have. Thank you.